Ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today. My name is Paul Wright, the director of CITRIS. As always, we have our web viewers out there in the electronic space somewhere. And I'd like to remind you about our seminar on Friday, which actually is about renewable resources on the grid. It's a personal friend of mine, David Watson at Lawrence Berkeley Labs. And since our governor has decried that there'll be, I think it's 30% renewables by 2020 on the grid. That's a very hot topic right now. Today, introducing David, he's the Associate Director, but more importantly, the head of the whole technical services at the Bancroft Library, and responsible for all aspects of the collection management, including the acquisitions, the copying, the catalog, the audiovisual materials, and a wide variety of preservation there. He's also a lecturer in the School of Library and Information Science at our neighbor at San Jose State. So let's have a warm welcome today for David De Lorenzo.
Thank you very much. Well, hello. I promise not to leap into the hallways and do what kind of these active, interactive things. I will stay hidden behind the podium and we'll all be safe. All right. Look, I approach this in a way that I assume most of you don't know what I do for a living. So I'm going to go through a lot of definitions and might be sounding a little pedantic along the way, and I apologize for that. But I think it's important for you to understand what it is that archivists do. And I consider myself an archivist, although I have a graduate degree in library and information science. Most of the work that has kept archivists busy, frankly, since I've been involved with it, has been how to manage our analog collections, that is mostly paper, and how to move forward with using instruments that have allowed us to make them more accessible to the public. So I'm going to start with a discussion of why do we keep archives. It seems to me very fundamentally important to understand why, as a species, we are interested in our past. And there are various different reasons for that. Certainly, the traditional reasons for keeping archive have been that we want to preserve our collective memory as humans and provide an historical perspective about what has occurred in our past. But it also includes, it seems to me, that we want to enable informed planning and decision making. And certainly, we're often asked, I think, as archivists, to provide information that enables leaders of our society to make decisions that are important to them and not repeat the mistakes of our past. So they're certainly supporting consistency and effectiveness in human action. There's no doubt that in my mind that we also communicate political, social, and cultural values to the society. And that could be here at Berkeley, it can be on the federal level or state level. Certainly, we're engaged in educating and providing personal enrichment in the sense of identity. And in recent years, I see certainly much more activities engaged, for example, in genealogy and one's own family history. And of course, we do provide evidence of rights, entitlements, and obligations that have been provided to us in our society. And so we thus support the rule of law in that regard. And finally, in more recent years, we've been much more engaged as archivists because of the digital effects that we've been dealing with more aggressively. We're engaged with, I think, more issues of accountability. That is, supporting information reporting, risk management, and audit review. And I can certainly cite the Enron case, for example, in which we all are probably familiar with that, where we have been much more engaged in capturing and controlling and keeping records that relate to business practices. Okay, so what do we keep? Essentially, this definition has changed over time. Certainly when I began my work 32 years ago as an archivist, we were dealing mainly with paper-based records. But as you can see, it certainly, the definition has become, as we'll go through my talk today, it has evolved and changed over time. Certainly recorded information in any form created or received and maintained by an organization or a person in the transaction of their business or conduct of affairs and kept as evidence of that activity. That's it basically in a nutshell. Now, as I said, as I began my career, it was mainly paper. And then it moved more to other formats of information, and now it's mainly digital. All right, so the common elements of records that we call records and archives are those body of information that I just defined. They're recorded information. They're not dependent on a form or format. They're created or received in the transaction of their business and have an organic unity. That is, when they're created, they're kept together out of an activity that individuals are involved with. So if certainly on this campus, we have records creators. They go to their job, they sit at their desktop, and they produce records every day. Not all of them, of course, are permanent value. They won't certainly end up in an archive, but that's what they do, and it has an organic unity to it. And these are, of course, kept, as I said, as evidence of those transactions or activities. Now, looking back, I would like to suggest to you that as an archivist, if I were to point to one event that occurred that I think finally brought to my profession the reality that our lives were changing, was the Prof's case. This is, of course, not an actual email. I'm making this up, so just for the record. This is not actually found in the record. But the White House had taken on an IBM email system called Profs. And Reagan had instituted it, and when he left, he didn't consider electronic records, email, to be a record. So then that got argued more aggressively when Bush became president, and then the National Security Archive in Washington, D.C. brought litigation to prevent Bush from treating it as if it were A, his personal records, and B, not a record at all. So what all of that really to me was not just about the fighting the issue of what the people of the United States own. That is, this is a product of his activity as President of the United States and reinforcing the Presidential Records Act. Those are certainly important issues, but what was important to me and the archival profession was that we were dealing with something incredibly different than ever before. So the concerns are, or were then, that okay, did this person, Dick Cheney, actually receive the record and when? Are there related records documenting the same process? Who accessed and used the record? Is the record accurate and authentic? Because as you may know, Bush's response after the courts told him to give those records, the email to them, he then gave them to them without their headers. The header to the email, so you wouldn't know who had sent it, what system it had been sent through, when it was sent, et cetera. So these are very important issues. So what is the software that created the record? How do I render that document over time? What is the record stored in? How long will the record be preserved? And are there any public policy and privacy issues relating or limiting its access? So certainly we were faced with, I think, a changing nature of records. Electronic records certainly are not inert physical entities with an interdependent logical structure and physical relationships. This is very different than dealing with files and folders and putting those folders in a file cabinet and having physicality to that and a relationship that has connection to that we can see and feel and smell and whatever else you want to do with it, with your senses. There's no longer need to have a physical arrangement scheme or a physical place for each record in a single, what we call an archive series. So if it's all correspondence, it doesn't actually need, in the electronic world, to be all together. Often these are created dynamically, and the record's assembled often from a variety of sources, but it does not exist as a discrete unit created in what it's created in. So as you all know, and we have these experiences almost every day now. Virtual documents, hypermedia, email with attachments, web pages, etc. So records are much more difficult to capture, access, and describe. Constant hardware and software changes make it difficult to keep records alive and useful over time. And traditional methods of describing records may be inadequate or useful. And the custodial role for archives is also changing. People don't actually have to come to an archive if they want to see and access electronic records. Certainly, that's the way it's moving. So in electronic records, there was an archival reinvention. In defining provenance, that is, where does a record come from? What is that entity that created it? Very important to understand that. What is the context of that record coming from? There is much more emphasis, it seems to me, now on creating processes and functions and understanding those rather than on the actual organizational structure. You should understand that traditionally with paper-based records, we would go to the highest level of a hierarchy, say here at the Chancellor's office at Berkeley, and we'd say, okay, we assume that most records of a permanent value will be either culled by that office or created by that office, and that's where it is. We'll go there. Well, that's not certainly the way it works anymore. Records are created by different offices and shared, and so there's this distribution that we have to be concerned about. The focus on context and purpose of creation as derived from conceptual models is much more prevalent in our work, and it's less reliance on the physical examination of records. We would go and actually look at the records and do random sampling of it and see what is the information content. And when you deal with records, look, at Michigan last year, they had over 100 million emails. How is it possible to look at the information content of all of those to decide whether they are records of enduring value? It's not. So there's also then increased focus on evidentiary values and less on the information content. And it's much more an active role for archivists to be engaged now in the whole process. Before, we would stand back and wait for stuff to come. And maybe it would come or maybe it wouldn't. And now we find that if we wait for it to come, it will not come. Or it will be created in a software solutions that are no longer viable or reliable over time. All right, so in that sense, there's also major concerns about the preservation. And what are those goals for us as archivists? We're concerned basically with two things: the authenticity of the record, that is, its original characteristics, and with respect to its context, its structure, and its content. As I suggested with email, for example, we want the headers, we want the body of the email, and we want it to be able to be persistent over time. And so certainly that talks to our concerns about reliability and usability of those records over time. All right. Now, usually in a traditional sense, we've been dealing with a manipulation of records and describing for our users how they should get access to them. In 1977, I could probably, I think, fluff that date a little bit, but the Society of American Archivists formed a committee to study how should we describe archival collections. Believe it or not, before then, there were no standards. There was no standard best practices that we now understand to be in place. So they created the structure of a finding aid. This included historians as well as archivists, and they were interested, I think, in looking at how we can standardize the description of our collections in our possession. And so that included provenance, the arrangement of the records, their format, their content, and the dates. And it presented this information finally in a standardized form. When I was library director at the Maryland Historical Society, we had these wonderful item-level lists of our collections that were done by historians who were looking for work during the the Great Depression, and the WPA hired them. And these were these huge, like 500-page inventories. And so everyone was doing something different. There was no standards whatsoever. And it finally became to pass in the 70s, in fact, when this actually came about. Now, along the way, archives felt many of them in academic institutions were part of libraries. And along the way, libraries have always been, since the 50s anyway, using a system that was developed by the Library of Congress called MARC, Machine Readable Cataloging. They took the card catalog and they moved it into a format that was usable and could be shared among other libraries. And that's called MARC 21. Archives did not engage in that. They had been basically, they felt that they only needed to create paper-based finding aids that were very detailed, that could describe the collections, and that was their job. So there came to pass a movement by people, in fact, my age, in the mid-1980s, these young Turks right out of library school who had been engaged in learning about standardization of information and best practices, and they defined the need for and use for MARC in describing the collections. And what they decided to do is they call it collection level. So it's an abstract, essentially, using the MARC format. And this is what you see on OSCIcat. I'm sure many of you have used that. That is a MARC format. And it employs other content standards like standardized vocabularies, the Library of Congress subject headings, the Library of Congress name authority file, et cetera. All right, so even though this was a very successful move in the mid-80s, moving in the direction of describing still with electronic format-based systems our paper-based collections. We still had all these paper-based finding aids that we had been building for 100 years or more, and they described our paper-based collections. So what should we do with all that stuff? Basically, a user would have to come into our facility in order to even see the bibliographic descriptions about those collections. So we wanted to move forward with a way of doing that. And at Berkeley, that was done with EAD, which means encoded archival description. It started out as an SGML coding system. It's now XML. But it provided a standard encoding system for the structure of the finding aid, and it set rules for the intellectual and physical parts of the archival finding aids. And as you can see, the chronology, if you want to, you probably can see it in YouTube if you want, but it started here at Berkeley, it's spread, and it's now international in its scope, and it's what CDL now uses on the Online Archive of California. Well, that was great. We now had our finding aids online, but we now had a mechanism for actually delivering the collection contents themselves through the other developments in technology, that is scanning, digital imaging. And so we could create a digital object and embed those objects within the finding aid, the EAD finding aid. Now, we began with a number of projects here at Berkeley. All these are grant-funded projects. We're fairly actively involved with. Most of our projects are funded by outside sources, usually federal agencies. And the number of projects, I don't want to get into how many. I think I have like 21 grant-funded projects right now that I'm balancing, but that's usually the case at Bancroft. But we started to use them for not just our traditional scanning of textual material, photographic material, but we moved on with other kinds of format solutions and embedded that information in the EAD encoding so people could click on the link and then see the image. I'm simplifying this to some extent to get through this rather quickly, but I believe that what you see then evolving with this is an activity where we then started using EAD to create and use it for other purposes that it wasn't intended, and that was to create a thematic access to various different collections. So one of them was Chinese in California, and you can go to our website later if you want to see that. But what that was is a multi-institutional thematic approach to collections at other institutions where we kind of kludge all of that information into the EAD. Now remember, the EAD was constructed just for finding aid. Now we're using it for multiple institutions, using that to then produce our documents in the digital arena. So unfortunately, that has limitations. It's structured like a finding aid. You can't browse. At that time, we could not browse the digital objects, and you couldn't present web-like experiences that people want to enjoy as they do with HTML documents. All right. So we then moved to the Web-ification, that's what I'll call it, Web-ification, using XTF and the style sheet XLST or whatever, and METS. And METS is a big development that we've been involved with over the years with the California Digital Library. The first example of the use of XTF was the San Francisco earthquake and fire, which came out in 2006. And that style sheet allowed us to create the data still in an EAD. If you go to the Online Archive of California, and you'll see that it's still kind of in the basic finding aid structure with all, I think, 8 institutions that were engaged in this project. But if you come from it from our website where the style sheet has been written, you won't know that you're going to that database. You'll see various different ways of getting to it. So it allowed browsing of images, and so the next phase of this was certainly engaging METS, which allowed, I think, browsing of images, applying a topic-oriented approach, focusing on a broader group of users, reusing existing descriptive metadata found in the MARC catalog, and reusing existing digital images, creating a web-based content management tool called what we call WebGenDB, which I'll show you in a minute, with a secure access methodology, and it's centralized data management using a digital library standard, and we know as METS, Metadata Encoding Transmission Standard. And it also instituted in that project persistent identifiers. This is what the workflow looks like for our digital library, and this was developed in collaboration with Berkeley and CDL, the California Digital Library. So you see on the left-hand side, in the red, rather, that is WebGenDB. We create the descriptive metadata. Then off to the left of that, we then take those items. It creates a work order, and then it moves through to the digital imaging lab. And then those structural metadata and administrative metadata are inputted into WebGenDB, and then it moves on to creation of EAD and METS. And then it's sent to OAC for presentation on the web. Okay. This is the METS schema that we use. It certainly has changed a little bit over time, but it gives you an idea of what the structure of this looks like behind the scenes. There's at the top level, the thing, and then when it has multiple items that drive it, children of the parent, there's associated metadata with the item itself. And then it's sent out using a style sheet for the purposes of presentation on the web. This is what it looks like when you see it. As you can see, there's the metadata on the right, and it links to those images. Fairly simple. Well, actually not. And here's an item at the item level. Again, the metadata is associated with the item, so we don't lose the provenance, the information about the context of where it came from. This is a big problem, I think, on the web, where we're getting people trawling through our websites, grabbing information, putting it onto other locations, and people lose all that metadata that we've built into it. So they don't know where it comes from, who created it, when it was created, et cetera. All right, so there are a lot of issues, in my opinion, with analog conversion. We are essentially at a crossroad. We are faced with, in archives, two paths. One, we still have gobs of paper and other formats, analog formats. We have millions of pages, millions. We haven't even touched on, look, in Bancroft, I have 8 million photographic images, and we've only scanned maybe 300,000. That's it. And it's all been on grant funds. There's no infrastructure here at Berkeley to do that scanning. So we have to rely on external sources to do that. But that's, even if that were true, suppose I had all that money. So suppose I had 5 full-time people in the digital imaging lab, it would take forever, generations to scan it. Because we're not dealing with a format like a book. We're dealing with fragile images, fragile items. They can't be sent through a shredder or machine that can scan them quickly. At least there's no technology yet to do that. So we're kind of struck by that problem, as well as the fact that the funding agencies have lost interest in digital capture because it was so expensive. In the earthquake and fire project, it took up half the costs of that project, which was a $1.2 million project. Half of it were for digital capture. So you can see federal agencies are not that interested anymore in that issue. They're much more interested in finding technological advances and solutions that can handle the digital capture at a massive rate of speed. Okay, metadata is also very labor intensive at the item level. Archivists do not and have not been concerned with descriptions of collections at the item level. In one collection, I can have, recently we received, for example, the congressional papers of Robert Matsui. That was a collection of 600 cartons. Each carton has about 1,600 pages. That would take a lot of time for me and certainly a lot of expense to have to describe each item at that level. It's just not possible. Nobody has that kind of staffing support. So we've gone in other directions with analog material, and we've tried to describe them at, say, the carton level or the collection level, and reuse that data over and over again. And we'll see if that works. The digital tool that we created, WebGenDB, even though it works, it has created a number of workflow problems for us. We've had to then migrate all of our existing finding aids into it in order to create a warehouse for the data. We have to create documentation constantly to write up descriptions for users of it so they understand how it works each time a change is made. It's a very difficult tool to use for our users. It's not as simple, for example, as going to a MARC cataloging template and filling that out. And it has a lot of customizations that have to be made, which are not always quite successful. And it certainly, what we also found, as I said, it's very difficult at this point to see how we can scan oversized posters and broadsides and maps in a way that would not damage them in the process. The technology is not there. So we've looked at other directions. That is, we have been microfilming our collections for many years, and we're now looking at how, because the technology has improved greatly, the equipment's for scanning microfilm, we are now moving forward more aggressively in scanning and making the collections accessible that way. And again, of course, reusing images on Calisphere, which is a product of the California Digital Library. All right, so what's Bancroft's response for future goals? We want to, of course, digitize within the limits of fiscal and staffing capabilities. And as you know, we're confronted with reductions in the federal agencies' interest in this area, as well as the campus's economic and fiscal crisis. We're trying to find new ways of moving that forward. We want to reuse existing descriptive metadata whenever possible and create minimum level information when we have to create new descriptive metadata. We want to develop an integrated collections management system that supports an integrated control operation using what is now being developed through a Mellon-funded project. It's now being called Archivist Toolkit. This is an open source software solution for collection management. Why that's important for us is because we only want to keystroke data that is descriptive metadata about collections once if we can, and move that data out of a collection management system to create finding aids and create a MARC record and not have my staff having to do these different processes along the way. It's too labor intensive. So I'm having great hope that this will come about. It's still in the process. I think it's at beta stage. And then there, along the way, with institutional records, we've seen great developments in the development of electronic document management systems. With archive come the responsibilities of records management. That is, dealing with records creators at the time that they create material and looking at it from the start of the life cycle and moving that material through as it becomes inactive, no longer of interest to the record creator, and then defining that material through a software solution so that we end up with what's a permanent record. I hold great hope with that because it embeds records retention and disposition schedules in it, which tell people what to keep and not keep over time. And at Berkeley, as you may know, we're a very decentralized university. We're working right now with IS&T to focus on the development of a single software solution for campus records creators. And I'm hoping that there will be some success in that, because what that means is that if people actually, as they're creating records, define how long it should be kept and not kept, and what its metadata is, and that responsibility falls on them, because they have to do that when they use an electronic document management system, then we will end up in the archive with a final product that comes with the metadata. That's my hope anyway. And along the way, we are also still concerned with personal papers, that is, the records created by people. All you faculty out there, we are very interested in your records. We want to keep them. We want to preserve them in the archive. But we don't have control like we do over someone working in, an administrative assistant in the office. Faculty and others who create their records usually wait till they're retired or after they've passed on to another level of reality. Then they leave those records with us, and they come in all shapes and sizes, stored in different places like sheds and basements and attics. This is our life. So I think it's very important now that we are dealing with a world that's gone digital. That's especially true with faculty and others, authors of fiction. We will go to their home and they point to their computer and say, "There are my records." And we scratch our head and say, "Well, okay, thank you, and can we borrow it?" And we bring it back with us. But all we've done so far is look at the diskettes and the 5.5-inch floppies that are written on WordStar and wonder what the hell are we going to do with that stuff. I shouldn't say this, but last year, one of my archivists, doing their job, certainly, took 5.5-inch floppies and put them in file folders, acid-free file folders, labeled the file as an archivist does, and put that information in the finding aid. So the interesting thing here is that they were following the way that they deal with analog, paper-based records. They're doing absolutely nothing wrong, but this is not an analog record. It's a database on a floppy. in a software the system that doesn't exist anymore. So, you know, this is, I think, faces up to the problem that we all are facing with records, and how do we deal with them. So I want to suggest to you that there are potentially solutions here. Even though we've been dealing with digital records for some couple decades now, easily, we're just now looking at how can we develop a workflow and a process that creates at the end of it, a solution that gets our users to the permanent records. So right now we're looking at how to deal with personal papers. This is an offshoot of a project called AIMS, A-I-M-S, that was developed by the Stanford University Library and others. And they are now looking at how to use software solutions to both capture and preserve and describe electronic records. So here's a workflow that we're suggesting here. We're going to put this information first into our collection management tool. We do have one here. It's a MySQL database. We haven't yet moved to Archivist Toolkit. As I mentioned a moment ago, we're going to create a MARC record at the collection level in Millennium, which is our OSCE cat. We're going to move that information into WebGenDB, and then we're going to ingest it into our local systems. This is going to take forensics software. We're looking at building on what was managed through the project, the AIMS project in Stanford. They used, I think it's a software that was developed for the crime and criminology, the FBI forensics toolkit, which is a proprietary software. There are open source software solutions. What this does is it pulls out that data. It keeps it in its original form. It allows us to open up different file formats and look at it when we need to, the information content, to make decisions about its relationship to whatever series or taxonomies that we think should be embedded in this file structure. And we can literally then move our work to a format that we're used to, that is putting things into kind of a Windows folder situation where they associate one another in the folder. And then move it forward to the digital preservation repository at the California Digital Library, and then make it accessible from our server using some kind of template like the one we use with the Online Archive of California. It certainly builds on an infrastructure that we have in place already, but it may not work. I mean, certainly these are questions that we will be faced with as we move forward with this project, but that's essentially where we are now. All right, and the other slide is essentially the intellectual work control. You can look at this later if you want. All right, so I want to end with this famous quote from the National Archives: "What is past is prologue." Certainly that relates, it seems to me, to the notion that we learn from our mistakes as humans. What we want to learn from the past is what we will apply to the future. And this wonderful quote from Ambrose Bierce, who is a Californian, we have his papers in the Bancroft: "Future, that period of time in which our affairs prosper, our friends are true, and our happiness is assured." What I think I'm really trying to get at here is that archives as a profession is changing as well. It's not just because of the digital collections that we are getting, but it's the expertise that we will need to have in order to move forward in keeping archives in the future. That will take team efforts, that will take efforts with IT people, it will take efforts with historians and other scholars. It cannot be done by ourselves in isolation. So I think that's where I'm going for, and I think that's where you'll see much more collaborative efforts on our part in that way. All right, thank you very much. I appreciate your listening.
Do we have any questions about archiving? Here you go.
Could you describe the strategy used by the Bancroft for preventing the expanding inventory of digital records from becoming the 5.5-inch floppies of the future. That is, from becoming inaccessible in the future as retrieval technology and storage technology changes.
Yeah. That's a very good question. I think what we're looking at is the collaboration with the California Digital Library and using their digital preservation repository and capturing records of long term. What that does for us on an immediate level is that once we place them there, that we can be assured that they'll be looking at the, making sure that there's no degradation of the bit, the levels, and that kind of things. But that doesn't, though, speak to our work to appraise, that is, get rid of stuff that's not necessary, because, look, only 3 to 5% of what's created is actually of an enduring permanent value. But so at least we have an immediate solution to that. And they're now collaborating with the San Diego supercomputer, so I think there's enough storage space for us to do that. But that means, though, we also have to be much more aggressively engaged in appraisal and how to appraise. And I think I touched on some of those ideas about context and function of the office and those kinds of things, rather than having to do random sampling and opening up email to make sure that that's important. It's just not possible to do that. So I think that's what's going to happen. But beyond that, then, our descriptions are going to have to, as we process those collections, and it looks as if there's going to be some manipulation by an archivist, a digital archivist, to move those into file folders so that there is some kind of intellectual construct to them so we can have access. And then along that way, there'll also probably be a further hit on what we keep and don't keep. And what I'm suggesting to you, though, is that archivists, not historians, are now making those decisions about what's kept for the future. And I think that's been a big debate in the archive profession. Is that really our responsibility, or should it be done in isolation? And it's very, very complicated. I mean, what we're talking about is, what is the historical record going to be for the future? And our archivists are the ones shaping that. That's kind of a scary thought when you think of it, to some extent. Well, it scares me, and I'm an archivist. Yes.
Yes, thank you very much. My question, I guess, follows on your answer to the previous one, which is, suppose people who use the end product, who are knowledgeable in history, social science, something about the field, opine that something's wrong with the metadata. Is there a process for in place, or is there imagined how that would be incorporated, and who says that that's the proper judgment? Because in the paper world, historians just layer over their interpretations over the last interpretations, and somebody thinks that that's an okay thing to do. That's actually part of the profession of being a good historian. But how does that get translated in this metadata context? Thank you.
Yeah. No, I think it's a very good question. I think beyond the issue of, well, that's a spelling mistake, or that, the name is spelled wrong, or maybe that's really not the subject of that correspondence or that series. What we are, I think, challenged by is we are not an expert on every subject. I worked at Harvard Law School for 10 years, and when I first started working there, I knew nothing about the law. And here I was cataloging medieval manuscripts. And, there's lots of different language and concepts and ideas and things being thrown out that I had no idea. But, we are the only ones that are there doing that work. And so we try our best to apply standards and best practices that we've developed for different disciplines and not look at one discipline per se and be an expert on it. Certainly we have to depend on our users to help us with that. It's at that end where we present the stuff out, and then we get responses back from scholars. Having said that, though, I have a stack of corrections that should be made, but to do that means, having someone to do that. And it's very complicated, too, in changing the finding aid. the way, I probably didn't touch on this because I don't want to sound like I'm whining, but WebGenDB is a very nice tool to create METs and whatnot and put stuff up on the web. But once it's there and someone wants to change a finding aid, then I have to go back to WebGenDB, redo it, then it has to be validated and goes through the library systems office. So it can take at least 5 to 6 months for a change. And I'm talking just a small change. You know, we added a bit of correspondence to a collection or something, and it takes that long. So the rapidity of response is also very slow because the system is so complicated and the process and steps that have been created are very bureaucratic. Sure.
First of all, I just wanted to say, I guess, thank you to you and your colleagues and for what is, I think, largely a thankless task. You know, we just kind of expect this stuff to be there when we need it, but most of the time we don't think about it. But my question is, I just was curious of your perspectives on things like the Internet Archive and its Wayback Machine, also like Google Scholar, Google Books, pretty much Google's mission of organizing the world's information, and how does that relate to your type of organization? How do you see the relationship between your organization and projects like that going forward?
Yeah. Let me think of my answer in a political way. I am certainly, like everyone else, amazed, surprised, and thrilled by the new technologies that have come about. But I'm an administrator, so I have other concerns about that. Let me just focus on Internet Archive for a moment. Their business model is doomed to fail. They have no support systems. And I'm probably being radical and controversial in saying that, and I'm sure you've heard from their and seen their director talk quite often about that, but I can tell you from my own experiences that it's one thing to deal with published books and not have to deal with the fragility issues of digital capture, and then there's the other problem of their presentation. It's too complicated. We were asked a few years ago to, when they were winding down the IA project, and we did submit books to them, and they have done microfilm scanning for us. But when CDL received and had to make decisions about what to share on HathiTrust, they wanted us to look at the file structure. And I have to say that I was quite shocked, surprised, amazed at how complicated all of it was. There must have been 30 different file structures, file extensions. I don't see how that will be maintained long term. And their business model, at least at IA, is rather troubling to me. Where will they be in 10 years when, say, their director no longer becomes interested in the project or passes away? There is no institutional support for that. Google, on the other hand, doesn't have that problem. But we were in conversations with Google, and they were very interested in scanning our book collection. And I was very interested in taking advantage of their financial possibilities. But they wanted to treat everything like they were modern books. And I'm not going to send them, when I have the only copy in the United States of a book, it's just not. I went to see their facility. They had 200 scanners, young people scanning, flipping pages, scanning, pushing a button. And although it was very well organized, admittedly, I don't think they lost any books at all, and very few were damaged. The curators in the Bancroft were absolutely adamant against it, and I would be remiss to see that. So I think what I'm really talking about here is the technology problem with the hardware. Has not quite yet gotten to where we feel comfortable with it yet. IA is a different matter because they were using a very different technology, if you know what their process is. But so it was, and they were doing it up at our Northern Regional Library facility where the books were already stored. So we didn't have that problem of sending them off to Mountain View. That doesn't speak, though, to the presentation stuff, which I think Google has done a wonderful job at. Most of our things, most of it is out of copyright, so it wouldn't have that problem. The exciting and potentials there of moving a collection which is mostly not in English. It's either in Spanish or in the Bancroft's case, but at other places like Harvard where much of their collections are in Latin. I mean, the possibilities of having that all converted into English or the language that population reads and opens all that up to research possibilities, I think is really exciting. So I don't know if I'm answering your question or not, but.
I think we have time for one more question. Here you go.
Well, this isn't so much a question as kind of an answer to the last question or another view, which is that a huge difference between what Internet Archive is doing and Google also and what the Bancroft Library is doing it revolves around the whole issue of finding aids and metadata. I mean, the Internet Archive, there is really no, except with the books that they've gotten from some libraries, I think, and I think just recently they've gotten more into creating MARC records. But mostly, it's just a free-for-all. I mean, there are no standard metadata fields that you can rely on when you're looking for information, and I think that's a huge difference.
I agree, and we've only given them MARC records because that's what we have available, because they've only been doing books, so they're reusing the MARC data from us. Yep. All right. Anything else? All right. Thank you very much. Thank you.